In a land where boys were trained to kill from the age of 7, an entire class of women lived under chains, silenced by fear. The warriors' strength, their glory, was carved from unspeakable suffering. And what those women endured, Sparta never wanted remembered. This is the story Sparta tried to erase. Before we reveal the horrors hidden beneath Sparta's legend, tell us, from where in the world are you watching? Subscribe to History Vault, because the past isn't just battles and glory. It's also the stories the victors tried to bury.
Welcome to the new video. Beneath the bronze helmets, crimson cloaks, and gleaming shields of Sparta's warriors, there was a darkness rarely spoken of. To the outside world, Sparta was a society of military perfection, a land where men were forged into soldiers from the moment they could walk, where women were celebrated for their strength and resilience, and where freedom was prized above all else. Yet, behind this facade of glory, Sparta was built upon the broken backs of a people trapped in chains, and among those enslaved, none endured greater suffering than the women. The Spartans called their enslaved class the Helots, men and women taken from conquered lands, forced into lives of servitude to sustain the warrior elite. They tilled the fields, harvested the crops, and raised the wealth of a state that boasted of freedom only for its citizens. But for Helot women, the reality was far worse. Their bodies, their families, even their very futures were not their own. They lived under constant surveillance, their every move judged through the cold eyes of Spartan masters. From the outside, one might expect Spartan discipline to extend into fairness or restraint. After all, these were men trained to endure hardship, men who spoke of honor and valor. But the truth was far more brutal. Spartan society thrived by deliberately dehumanizing its slaves. Helot women were not just workers, they were property, exploited in ways that defy imagination. Their humiliation was systematic, designed not merely to break their bodies but to destroy their spirit. The contradiction was staggering. Spartan boys were raised to believe that their freedom and power rested on their ability to dominate others. At 7 years old, they left their mothers to enter the agoge, the brutal military training that forged them into warriors. By the time they emerged as men, they were conditioned to see helots as less than human, creatures to be used, controlled, and discarded. And for Helot women, this meant a life where abuse was not an accident of circumstance, but a policy of the state. Imagine the silence of the Spartan countryside, beyond the city walls where warriors sharpened their spears. And trained in phalanx formations, Helot women bent their backs in the fields from dawn until dusk. Their hands were blistered from the sickle, their faces burned by the relentless sun. The grain and olives they harvested did not feed their children. They filled Spartan tables, fed Spartan armies, sustained Spartan wars. For this endless toil, they were rewarded not with bread or mercy, but with scorn. Spartan citizens spat upon them in the streets, mocked their accents, and treated their presence as a stain. But physical labor was only part of their torment. Helot women endured something far darker within the hidden chambers of Sparta's society. They were trapped in a world where their bodies were commodities, tools for producing more slaves, for pleasing their masters, or for humiliating them in public rituals designed to remind everyone of their lowly status. In a society obsessed with strength, their vulnerability became a stage for cruelty. The Helot women lived under a permanent shadow, the Krypteia. This was the secret institution of Spartan terror, a yearly ritual in which young warriors in training were unleashed upon the Helot population. Ostensibly, its purpose was to instill discipline and weed out rebellion. In practice, it was legalized murder. Each year, Spartan youth stalked the countryside under cover of night, hunting helots as one might hunt animals. To the women, this meant living with constant fear. They might lose husbands, sons, or even their own lives in the darkness, all sanctioned by the laws of their masters. Even in peace, there was no reprieve. Helot women could be called upon at any moment to serve the desires of their owners. Spartan society, paradoxically obsessed with the purity of its citizen women, often relegated sexual exploitation to its slaves. In this way, Helot women became both invisible and indispensable. Invisible in their suffering, indispensable in the continuation of Spartan power. They were silenced by law, by custom, and by violence, their stories left untold, because no Spartan chronicler saw them as worthy of record. And yet, their existence was central. Without Helot women, there would have been no Spartan state. While men trained endlessly for war, and citizen women prepared the next generation of warriors, it was Helot women who kept the machinery of daily life running. They spun the wool, prepared the food, tended the children, and kept the fields alive. They were the unseen backbone of Sparta's greatness, and the most abused victims of its cruelty. To understand Sparta's greatness, one must also understand its darkness. The Spartans may have triumphed at Thermopylae, their warriors immortalized in bronze and poetry, but their society was rooted in fear. Fear of rebellion, fear of weakness, fear of the very people they enslaved. And so they crushed Helot women beneath a system that sought to erase their humanity entirely. This was the unspeakable truth of Sparta, that its warriors, celebrated across history for their valor, built their legend upon the suffering of women who could not fight back. Their stories remain largely hidden, their names erased, their voices silenced. But in the shadows of history, their suffering lingers, a reminder that even the most celebrated societies carry scars that glory cannot conceal. And as we peel back the layers of Spartan life, we uncover the darkest reality, the unspeakable things done not on the battlefield, but in the homes, fields, and secret chambers where Helot women endured horrors no hoplite spear could ever defend against. This is their story. To understand the plight of enslaved women in Sparta, we must first understand the Helot system itself, a system unique in all of ancient Greece. Unlike the chattel slavery of Athens, where slaves were often foreign captives bought and sold in the marketplace, the Helots were a people, a nation enslaved within their own homeland. Most were Messenians, descendants of proud warriors and farmers who had once resisted Sparta's expansion. But when Sparta conquered their lands in the bitter wars of the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, these people were not simply defeated. They were reduced to a permanent underclass, bound not to individual owners but to the state itself. Every Spartan citizen was allotted Helot families to work the land on his behalf. While he drilled endlessly in the agoge or stood in the phalanx at war, it was the Helots who farmed his fields, harvested his olives, tended his vineyards, and brought in the grain that fed his household. The system was brilliantly cruel. Spartan men were warriors precisely because they did not have to labor. The Helots labored for them and paid the price in blood and dignity. The numbers tell the story. For every Spartan citizen, there were at least 7 Helots. Some ancient accounts even suggest 10 or 12. Imagine the weight of that imbalance. A tiny warrior elite, surrounded on all sides by those they had enslaved. The Spartans lived with the constant terror of rebellion, and so their system was designed not merely to exploit the Helots, but to terrorize them into submission. Nowhere was this terror felt more deeply than among Helot women. They were not merely agricultural laborers, though that alone would have been exhausting beyond measure. They were also the caretakers of households, expected to spin, weave, cook, and raise children who by law would never be free. Their daughters were born into slavery, their sons destined to till fields for masters who despised them. Each generation of Helot women carried the weight of chains heavier than iron, the chains of a fate that could never be broken. The Spartans institutionalized humiliation. It was not enough for the Helots to serve. They had to be reminded constantly of their inferiority. Ancient writers speak of forced public rituals, where Helots were compelled to wear mock crowns of straw, to sing songs of their own weakness, to stagger drunkenly through the streets in spectacles designed to amuse their Spartan masters. For women, these rituals were doubly degrading, stripping them not only of dignity, but of the protective veil of modesty so prized in ancient culture. What should have been private was made public, and what should have been honorable was turned into ridicule. The Helot system was not simply about forced labor. It was about control of the body itself. Helot men could be slaughtered in the Krypteia, their strength seen as a threat. Helot women, meanwhile, were reduced to tools for reproduction. Spartan society's obsession with purity meant that citizen women were shielded from outsiders. But when it came to maintaining control, Spartan masters saw no contradiction in exploiting their slaves. Helot women were expected to bear children who would themselves be enslaved, ensuring that the population of workers never dwindled. In this way, their very fertility was not their own. It was a resource to be harvested by their conquerors. And yet, there was no path to freedom. In Athens, a slave might one day be manumitted, purchasing their liberty or being freed by a generous master. But in Sparta, the Helot system was designed to be permanent. It was not an individual condition, but a hereditary curse. Even if one woman somehow escaped the fields, her children, her family, her entire people remained in bondage. To be born Helot was to be condemned before drawing your first breath. The cruelty of the Helot system extended into the smallest details of daily life. Spartan citizens had legal rights, but Helots had none. If a Helot woman was assaulted, she had no recourse. If her family was torn apart, she had no appeal. Her voice carried no weight in Spartan courts or councils. She existed at the mercy of men who were trained from childhood to see mercy as weakness. What made the Helot system especially horrific was its hypocrisy. Sparta prided itself on being the guardian of Greek liberty. They fought Persians at Thermopylae, claiming to defend freedom for all of Greece. Yet within their own borders, they created a system of bondage so total that it extinguished the very humanity of those trapped within it. Helot women were caught at the sharpest edge of this hypocrisy. While Spartan women were admired for their independence, unusual in the ancient world, Helot women were denied even the most basic autonomy. The contrast could not have been more stark. Freedom for some, degradation for others. The consequences of this system were generational. A Helot girl grew up watching her mother toil in the fields, serve Spartan masters, and endure indignities too painful to name. She knew that her own future would be no different. There was no hope of marrying freely, of raising children with dignity, of owning the fruits of her own labor. Every dream was crushed by the reality that she and her people were locked into an endless cycle of servitude. And this was exactly how Sparta intended it. The Helot system was not an accident of war, not a temporary arrangement. It was the foundation of Spartan society, a permanent institution of terror. Its purpose was to keep the warrior elite free from labor-free, to march, to fight, to conquer, and to remind every Helot woman that her life was not her own, her body, not her own, her children, not her own. This is why the system endured for centuries, not because it was efficient, not because it was just, but because it was designed to crush hope itself. And once hope is gone, rebellion is broken before it begins. For Helot women, the chains were not only on their wrists, they were in their hearts, their minds, their very souls. And that is what made their suffering unspeakable. If you want to grasp the full horror of what it meant to be a Helot woman in Sparta, you have to step inside her daily life. From dawn until dusk, her existence was a cycle of exhaustion, humiliation, and fear, structured with such brutal efficiency that it allowed no escape. The fields of Laconia and Messenia were her prison. The household of her Spartan master was her cage, and every hour of her day was claimed by someone else. The mornings began before the sun had fully risen. Helot women were driven into the fields, often with their infants strapped to their backs or small children trailing behind them. Their task was to cultivate the land that fed the Spartan elite. They plowed with primitive tools, bent over in endless rows of barley and wheat, worked the olive groves until their fingers bled, and pressed grapes for the wines that would grace the tables of their conquerors. It was not their land, not their crops. They would never taste the wealth they produced. At the end of each harvest, they were required to hand over a fixed share of their produce to their Spartan masters, a share that could be increased at whim. To fall short was to invite brutal punishment, beatings, torture, even death. But the field labor was only one half of their burden. Inside the oikos, the Spartan household, Helot women performed the domestic work that kept their masters comfortable. They baked bread, spun wool, wove cloth, carried water, and maintained fires. They prepared meals for Spartan boys training in the agogj, fed Spartan warriors, and served the Spartan women who, unlike most Greek women, enjoyed unusual freedoms. The irony was bitter. While citizen women in Sparta could inherit land and direct estates, their Helot counterparts were the invisible labor that made this independence possible. Every act of freedom for a Spartan woman was purchased at the price of Helot servitude. The demands placed on Helot women went beyond labor. They were subject to indignities carefully crafted to remind them of their place. Ancient sources describe Helots being forced to wear degrading clothing, animal skins or caps, to mark their inferiority. Women in particular were sometimes made to appear in mocking processions, their dignity paraded as a spectacle for the Spartans' amusement. It was not enough that they worked like beasts of burden. They had to be seen and treated as less than human, and always there was fear. The Krypteia, the secret police of Sparta, operated as a perpetual terror. Each year, when the Spartan ephors declared war on the Helots, it gave Spartan men the legal right to kill them without consequence. Young Spartan initiates in the Krypteia would prowl the countryside, murdering Helots at random to instill fear and eliminate potential leaders. For Helot men, this meant constant vulnerability. For Helot women, it meant something worse. They not only risked losing fathers, brothers, and husbands without warning, but they could themselves be targeted in ways that stripped them of bodily autonomy entirely. Helot women endured a particular form of exploitation that blurred the lines between labor and assault. Spartan masters saw them as breeding stock, a way to ensure a steady supply of slaves. Ancient accounts tell us that Spartan citizens would sometimes deliberately force Helot women into relationships with strong Helot men to produce more children, or worse, use them themselves. This was framed as a practical solution. Spartan men, discouraged from marrying too young or distracted by constant military training, could ensure population growth by exploiting Helot women. But to the women, this was nothing less than reproductive coercion. Their bodies became instruments for sustaining a system that oppressed them, their fertility harvested as coldly as grain from the fields. The children of these unions were bound to the same fate, enslaved from birth, their lives predetermined. Helot women had to raise them, knowing they would never escape the cycle. Imagine the cruelty of nurturing a child only to watch them grow into another exploited laborer or another victim of the Krypteia's knives. Hope itself was stolen before it could take root. Life for Helot women was also shaped by hunger. The food they produced was always siphoned first to their masters. What remained was meager, often insufficient. Malnutrition was common, especially among mothers who had to feed both themselves and their children. Pregnant women were forced to continue fieldwork without rest, their swollen bellies bent over plows, their bodies pushed until they broke. Miscarriages were common, but Spartans did not mourn lost lives. They mourned only lost property, lost future slaves. Disease added another layer of suffering. Poor living conditions in Helot quarters, cramped huts, minimal sanitation, exposure to the elements, created breeding grounds for illness. Spartan citizens had access to better housing and food, and their relative isolation shielded them from outbreaks. But Helot communities bore the brunt of plagues and fevers, and women in particular were left to nurse the sick with no resources, often falling ill themselves. The loss of a mother meant devastation not only for her children, but for the Spartan household that depended on her labor. Yet there was no compassion, only replacement. And even within the Helot community, women carried heavier burdens. Men, when not in the fields, could sometimes find ways to resist quietly, sabotaging tools, slowing work, or plotting rebellion. Women, tethered by children and domestic demands, had fewer options. Their resistance was often silent and hidden, teaching their children whispered songs of freedom, clinging to fragments of their old culture, finding strength in one another. Yet the Spartans knew this too. They deliberately broke these ties when they could, separating families, dispersing kin, and forbidding Helots from gathering in large numbers. The intention was clear: to prevent women from becoming the heart of cultural memory and rebellion. The sheer monotony of exploitation also served as a weapon. Days blended into weeks, years into decades. Generations passed with no change. A Helot woman might look at her grandmother and see her own life mirrored back, unchanged, unchanging. That continuity of despair was itself a form of control. When suffering feels eternal, resistance feels impossible. Yet despite all of this, fragments of resilience shone through. Archaeologists studying Helot settlements have found traces of their culture preserved in pottery, in hidden shrines, in burial practices that suggest a stubborn refusal to let their traditions die. Helot women, even under the heaviest chains, found ways to keep something of themselves alive. That quiet defiance, invisible to the Spartans, was perhaps the only freedom they could carve from the ruins of their lives. Everyday existence for Helot women was thus not merely toil, but a carefully designed system of degradation. It was work, yes, but work infused with humiliation, with terror, with the constant reminder that their bodies, their children, their very lives were not their own. They were the silent foundation of Sparta's military glory, the invisible hands that fed an empire of warriors. And the more the Spartans exalted their own freedom, the more savage was the contradiction under which Helot women lived, condemned to a life where freedom was not even imaginable. Humiliation was not an accident in the life of a Helot woman. It was a system, crafted, deliberate, and enforced by Spartan society to ensure that the enslaved remained broken in spirit as well as in body. The Spartans understood that sheer violence could suppress rebellion for a time, but degradation struck deeper. It attacked the soul. And nowhere was this more evident than in the rituals designed specifically to keep Helot women in a constant state of fear and submission. From the earliest records we have, it is clear that the Spartans saw humiliation as part of their strategy of control. Unlike other Greek polis, where slavery was harsh but often impersonal, Sparta institutionalized cruelty. Helots were often forced into ceremonies and spectacles where they were mocked, degraded, and paraded for the amusement of their masters. Helot men were sometimes made to appear drunk, forced to stumble and sing before Spartan youth as a lesson in temperance. But Helot women suffered humiliations that struck at their deepest vulnerabilities, their bodies, their dignity, and their roles as mothers. One of the most chilling aspects of Spartan dominance was the way in which Helot women were transformed into tools of reproductive control. Their wombs became instruments for maintaining the enslaved population. Spartan authorities knew that if Helot numbers dwindled, their agricultural and domestic base would weaken. So they ensured that Helot women bore children, but children who would never belong to them. Accounts suggest that Helot women were sometimes paired with chosen Helot men to breed strong stock, as though they were animals. More disturbingly, Spartan citizens themselves could exploit Helot women sexually without fear of punishment. Ancient commentators, including Plutarch, hint at this system, though often cloaked in vague language. The implication is clear. Helot women were seen not just as laborers, but as vessels for sustaining slavery itself. This abuse carried a dual purpose. On one hand, it ensured a steady stream of enslaved children who could serve the Spartan state. On the other, it acted as a constant reminder of powerlessness. A Helot woman's body was never her own. Her fertility, her motherhood, even the act of nursing her child could be twisted into a weapon against her. If she bore many children, she was cursed to watch them all grow into bondage. If she bore few, she risked punishment for failing to provide for the system. The cycle was designed to be inescapable. Humiliation also took the form of public degradation. In Spartan festivals, Helots were sometimes made to serve in ways that emphasized their subjugation. They poured wine, prepared feasts, and performed the menial labor that allowed Spartans to enjoy their religious and civic life. For Helot women, this meant not only service, but spectacle. They were reminders, living symbols of Spartan superiority. Their appearance, often forced into degrading clothing like animal skins or distinctive caps, marked them as different, inferior, something less than human. Every interaction was charged with ritualized inequality. The control extended even into the most private spaces. Helot women were often compelled to serve inside Spartan households, working under the eyes of their mistresses and masters. They prepared the food that Spartan warriors ate, washed their garments, and cared for their children. The irony was brutal. Spartan women, famous across Greece for their relative independence and power, depended on the invisible labor of enslaved women to sustain that very freedom. Helot women, meanwhile, had no such liberty. The proximity made the exploitation worse, for being forced to live so close to the lives of their oppressors only deepened the sense of captivity. And then there were the punishments, public, theatrical, and cruel. If a Helot woman dared to resist, to falter in her duties, or even to show pride, the response was swift. Beatings were common, but sometimes humiliation was worse than physical pain. Imagine being forced to stand before your community stripped of dignity, mocked by those who controlled your fate. Imagine being punished not in secrecy, but in ritualized performance designed to remind every other Helot woman what defiance would cost. The message was clear. You were not just beaten for yourself, but for all who might think of resisting. Sexual exploitation in particular carried with it a layer of humiliation that went beyond the act itself. For Helot women, there was no recourse, no justice, no protection. Spartan men could take what they wished, and the law not only permitted it, it sanctified it as part of the social order. Even if a Helot woman bore a child by a Spartan man, that child was condemned to slavery. There was no loophole, no escape route through motherhood. Every path was blocked, every possibility denied. This exploitation was not random. It was part of a calculated psychological strategy. By controlling women's bodies, the Spartans controlled the very possibility of Helot identity. They ensured that the enslaved population reproduced, but in a way that reinforced despair. Children grew up not as symbols of hope, but as reminders of bondage. Mothers raised them under the shadow of inevitability. Fathers watched helplessly as their families were trapped in a cycle from which no one could emerge. The rituals of humiliation also served another purpose. They fed Spartan identity. The existence of Helot women, degraded and exploited, allowed Spartans to see themselves as superior, as free, as chosen. Their entire self-image as the fiercest warriors of Greece rested on this foundation of domination. The more they humiliated their slaves, the more they reinforced their own sense of power. In this way, Helot women became unwilling actors in a drama that defined Spartan culture. Their suffering was not incidental. It was central to the very story Sparta told about itself. It is difficult to imagine the psychological toll this must have taken. A Helot woman might wake each morning knowing she would be watched, mocked, perhaps violated, and then expected to continue her labor as if nothing had happened. She might rock her child to sleep, while knowing that child has future held nothing but the same. Over years, over generations, such humiliation seeps into the marrow of a people. It becomes a silence carried in the body, a quiet despair that no words can fully express. Yet even here, resistance glimmered in small acts. Ancient testimonies hint at Helot rebellions and uprisings, often brutally suppressed. Behind those collective movements lay the daily defiance of women who refused to let humiliation destroy them entirely. They may have sung old songs while working in the fields, whispered prayers to gods long abandoned by their Spartan masters, or passed on stories of a time before slavery. These were fragile acts, but they were acts nonetheless. Proof that even in systems designed to erase dignity, dignity can survive. The rituals of humiliation and exploitation were thus more than cruelty for its own sake. They were mechanisms of control, essential to the functioning of Sparta itself. Without them, the system might have collapsed. But in their determination to break the Helots, the Spartans revealed something else: the fragility of their own society. For a culture that prided itself on strength, it is telling that it required such constant, systematic degradation of women to survive. And it is here, in the fate of Helot women, that we glimpse the true contradiction at the heart of Sparta. The warriors who stood at Thermopylae, who terrified other Greeks with their discipline and courage, built their world not on freedom or equality, but on the backs of enslaved women whose every day was a theater of humiliation. The unspeakable was not hidden in Sparta. It was woven into the fabric of their society, lived openly, and sustained deliberately. And it left scars not only on those who endured it, but on the legacy of Sparta itself. Punishment in Sparta was never only about the whip, the blow, or the visible scar. It was theater, a calculated performance designed to terrify and to linger in memory long after the bruises faded. For Helot women, this theater of punishment became one of the most brutal tools of control. The Spartans understood that fear is most effective when it is shared publicly, when it is not only inflicted on one body, but burned into the imagination of many. And so, Helot women became unwilling actors in spectacles of shame and cruelty that reinforced the system of slavery with psychological chains stronger than iron. Sparta thrived on spectacle. The agoge, the infamous Spartan education system, relied on ritual, performance, and public testing to forge warriors. But while Spartan boys were hardened by being observed in trials of pain and endurance, Helot women were broken by being placed at the center of humiliating displays. The difference was striking. What empowered the Spartan became a weapon to destroy the Helot. Consider the simplest form of punishment, the beating. A Spartan woman might discipline a Helot servant in her household. But unlike in private homes elsewhere in Greece, in Sparta, these punishments could be dragged into public view. Helot women were beaten not only for disobedience, but for failing to display the right attitude, for standing too tall, for speaking too proudly, for simply appearing less than submissive. By carrying these acts into public spaces, the Spartans ensured that every Helot woman watching understood her own vulnerability. The sound of the whip was meant to echo in the minds of dozens who had not been struck. Some punishments were deliberately ritualized. Ancient accounts describe how helots could be forced to wear distinctive clothing that marked them as slaves, such as dogskin caps or humiliating tunics. For women, this could be compounded by sexualized mockery, their garments torn or shaped to expose them, their bodies treated as objects of ridicule. Imagine the degradation of being forced to serve at a feast, dressed in rags designed to humiliate, while the very people who depended on your labor laughed at you. The spectacle was not only about the moment, it created lasting shame that followed a woman long after she returned to her work. But it was not just laughter or mockery that haunted Helot women. It was silence. Some punishments required them to endure without protest, to stand motionless as blows fell, or to continue their tasks as if nothing had happened. This silence was itself a form of domination, a test of how completely they had been stripped of agency. By forcing them into roles where no resistance was possible, the Spartans transformed them into living symbols of submission. Fear also lived in the unpredictability of punishment. Helot women never knew when or why they might be targeted. A whisper, a glance, even a rumor could bring disaster. This unpredictability created constant anxiety, a psychological weight heavier than chains. It fractured communities, making it difficult for Helot women to trust even one another, for fear that an act of solidarity could bring collective reprisal. At the heart of this theater of punishment was the Krypteia, the secret police of Sparta, composed of young Spartan men sent out at night to terrorize the Helots. While ancient sources often emphasize the killing of Helot men, the psychological impact on Helot women was immense. Every creak of the night, every shadow at the edge of vision, could be the sign of the Krypteia approaching. They knew their husbands, brothers, or sons might not return from the fields. They knew they themselves might be harassed or assaulted in the darkness. Sleep itself became dangerous, a moment of vulnerability. Over years, over generations, this constant dread became a permanent feature of Helot womanhood. The Spartans also employed collective punishment, a tactic as devastating to the psyche as any physical torment. If one Helot woman resisted, entire households could suffer. If one community showed signs of unrest, groups of women might be rounded up and punished together. This meant that every woman carried not only her own fear, but the crushing guilt of knowing her defiance could doom her friends and children. The system turned natural bonds of solidarity into sources of tension and suspicion. Even motherhood, normally a space of private intimacy, became a stage for psychological torture. Helot women often had to raise children under the eyes of their masters, knowing those children would never be free. Some were forced to nurse Spartan infants in addition to their own, an act that symbolized in the most intimate way the dominance of one people over another. A mother feeding the child of her oppressor while her own baby cried at her side. Such moments encapsulated the theater of humiliation that defined her life. The shame was both private and communal, because everyone knew this was how Sparta sustained itself, through the bodies and labor of enslaved women. And yet, there was a sinister genius to this theater. It was not merely about the act itself, but about the memory it created. Every time a Helot woman witnessed a public beating, every time she saw her peers humiliated at a festival, every time she lay awake listening for the approach of the Krypteia, her mind stored the image. These memories reinforced her fear more effectively than any law or decree. The Spartans did not need to patrol every field or household constantly. They had built an internal prison inside the minds of their slaves, one reinforced by endless rehearsals of punishment. We must also understand that this theater was not only for the Helots, it was also for the Spartans themselves. By staging punishment so publicly, the Spartans reminded their own children of their dominance. Young Spartan boys and girls grew up watching Helot women humiliated, internalizing the idea that their superiority was natural, divinely sanctioned. In this sense, every punishment was a performance with two audiences, one enslaved, one free. For the Helot, it bred despair. For the Spartan, it bred arrogance and entitlement. The paradox was cruel. Spartan women, often praised in Greek literature for their strength and independence, enforced these punishments against Helot women in their households. They too participated in the theater of humiliation. This created a layered oppression, where women who themselves lived in a patriarchal society found empowerment only by dominating other women. The result was a distorted hierarchy, in which Helot women bore the weight of both Spartan men, as cruelty, and Spartan women, as authority. And so the theater of punishment was not just a series of isolated cruelties, it was a system, one that touched every aspect of Helot women's lives. From the field to the home, from the feast to the cradle, their existence was staged in ways that reinforced submission and crushed resistance. The brilliance, if we can call it that, of Spartan cruelty lay in its creativity. They did not rely solely on swords or whips. They relied on shame, memory, and fear, tools that left no visible scars but carved wounds into the psyche. This is why the story of Helot women in Sparta is so haunting. Their lives were not defined simply by labor or even by violence, but by the constant awareness that their suffering was a performance in someone else's play. They were forced to live as symbols of defeat, their humiliation feeding the pride of their oppressors. And yet, despite this, traces of resistance remained. Whispered songs, shared stories, acts of quiet endurance, the theater of punishment sought to erase their humanity. The fact that we can still glimpse it today is proof that it did not fully succeed. Sparta was not merely a society of warriors, it was a society built on fear. And fear in Sparta was never an accident. It was a deliberate political weapon. The punishments inflicted on Helot women were not random acts of cruelty by masters or mistresses in moments of rage. They were part of a system carefully crafted to send messages, reinforce hierarchies, and remind both the enslaved and the free that the state of Sparta existed because Helot bodies sustained it. The suffering of Helot women was therefore not just personal, it was political. The Spartan system depended on the Helots in a way few other Greek states depended on their slaves. The Helots were not scattered individuals, but an entire conquered population, bound to the land they worked. They produced the grain, the oil, the wine, the lifeblood of Spartan survival. Without Helot labor, the famous Spartan warrior could not spend his life in the agoge or on campaign. Every spear raised at Thermopylae, every shield lifted on the plains of Plataea was made possible because a Helot bent her back in the fields, and this dependency terrified the Spartans, for it meant their entire social system could collapse if the Helots ever rose up. This fear dictated policy. Punishments for Helot women were not designed simply to discipline individuals. They were staged to remind the Helot population of its permanent subjugation and to remind Spartans themselves of their precarious dominance. Every public beating, every humiliation, every forced ritual carried a double political purpose: to suppress rebellion and to justify Spartan militarism. Take, for example, the annual declaration of war on the Helots, a bizarre custom recorded by ancient writers. Each year, the Spartan ephors, the overseers of state, formally declared war on their own slaves. This ritual gave legal cover to the killing of Helots, transforming private violence into public policy. For Helot women, this meant that their vulnerability was not only to individual Spartans, but to the entire apparatus of the state. At any moment, punishment could come, sanctioned not by whim but by law. The political message was chilling. Your suffering is not a crime. It is the foundation of our society. Punishments often coincided with moments of political tension. After revolts, after earthquakes, after wars, Helot communities faced intensified repression. Women bore the brunt of these crackdowns, not only because they were more accessible to Spartan control while men worked the fields, but because punishing women sent a louder message. A woman humiliated in public was not only an individual degraded, she was a mother, a daughter, a wife. Her suffering radiated outward into families and villages, creating ripples of fear. This was political calculation at its most ruthless. Hurt one, control many. We see echoes of this in the way Helot women were woven into the rituals of Spartan life. During certain festivals, Helots were forced to appear drunk, stumbling and mocked, to remind Spartan youth of the supposed superiority of their discipline. For women, this could involve public shaming that emphasized their bodies and sexuality, turning them into symbols of weakness and corruption. The political message was clear: Spartan order depended on Helot disorder. By presenting Helot women as degraded figures, the state reinforced the idea that Spartans were natural rulers. Even the intimate exploitation of Helot women carried political undertones. When Spartan masters or overseers used Helot women for reproduction, whether through coercion or forced arrangements, the children that resulted symbolized the dominance of one people over another. These acts blurred the lines of family, blood, and identity, turning private violation into a political weapon. Every Helot woman's womb was made a battlefield for Spartan control. Her children would carry the mark of subjugation, proof that even life itself was colonized by the state. It is important to see how these practices also shaped Spartan identity. The fear and hatred of Helots expressed in punishments became a central part of what it meant to be Spartan. Young Spartan men in the Krypteia were not simply hunting slaves, they were being trained in political domination. By terrorizing Helot communities, including women, they learned that violence was not only acceptable, but necessary for the survival of the state. Punishments became propaganda, rehearsals of ideology. Spartan women too participated in this political theater. While praised by outsiders for their independence compared to other Greek women, Spartan women's authority was often built on the backs of Helot women. By overseeing households, managing slaves, and sometimes directing punishments, they reinforced the political order. A Spartan woman humiliating a Helot maid was not just exercising personal power. She was acting as an agent of the state, perpetuating the system that freed her to live differently from other Greek women. This intertwining of personal cruelty with political necessity made Spartan punishment of Helot women particularly insidious. It ensured that even private acts of humiliation were not isolated, but part of a collective system of control. The political machine of Sparta did not operate only in the assembly or the barracks. It operated in the fields, in the kitchens, in the bedrooms, everywhere Helot women lived and labored. Over time, this system created a paradox. The harsher the punishments, the more dependent Sparta became on them. Every act of repression temporarily suppressed rebellion, but also deepened the hatred of the Helots. Every humiliation planted seeds of resistance. The Spartans responded with more cruelty, which in turn required more vigilance. It was a cycle of fear that bound master and slave alike. For Helot women, the cost was unending. Their lives became currency in the politics of survival. Ancient historians, when they mention the Helots at all, often reduce them to a faceless mass. But when we consider the specific experiences of Helot women, we see how deeply personal their suffering was, even as it served political ends. Their punishments were not accidents of cruelty, but calculated strategies. Every scar, every humiliation, every sleepless night became part of Sparta's defense system. And yet, this political manipulation carried a hidden irony. By building a society that relied so heavily on the degradation of others, the Spartans revealed their own weakness. The mighty warrior state feared across Greece depended utterly on women who had no weapons, no shields, no voices in the assembly. Their suffering propped up the very men who claimed to embody strength and freedom. In this light, the punishments of Helot women were not only political acts of control, they were confessions of insecurity, the desperate measures of a people who knew that without fear, their entire world would crumble. Sparta's cruelty did not vanish with the individual punishments of Helot women. What made these acts so devastating was how they lingered, seeping into memory, folklore, and cultural consciousness for generations. Punishment was never simply about the moment of pain. It was about what remained afterward. The scars carried on the body, the whispered warnings carried through families, and the collective fear carried through an entire community. Helot women lived not only under oppression, but under the memory of oppression, which became its own form of punishment. The power of memory in an oral society like Sparta cannot be overstated. Stories carried weight equal to law, often more so. For Helot women, every whipping, every humiliation, every act of sexual exploitation became more than a personal wound. It became a story retold in hushed tones to daughters, cousins, and neighbors. This is what happens if you resist. This is what happens if you disobey. These whispered narratives traveled across villages, embedding themselves into the collective psychology of the enslaved. Even when the lash was not present, the memory of its sting lingered, disciplining behavior long after the actual act had ended. Sparta relied on this cycle. For a system of domination to survive across centuries, it required more than physical violence. It required the creation of cultural memory, a climate where even imagining resistance seemed futile, because memory testified to what awaited those who tried. Helot women were key transmitters of this memory. As mothers, grandmothers, and caretakers, they passed down both trauma and survival strategies, shaping generations of Helots who understood instinctively that punishment was not exceptional, but normal, not a risk, but a certainty. The rituals of public humiliation made this memory especially potent. A woman forced to sing degrading songs or to perform mocked dances in front of Spartan youth did not experience her shame in isolation. Entire communities watched, their memories seared by the spectacle. Children saw their mothers degraded. Husbands saw their wives mocked. These moments became collective memories, ensuring that punishment extended its reach far beyond the individual. A single woman's humiliation might control dozens of lives, because the memory of her shame became a warning written into the cultural fabric. This lingering fear shaped the daily rhythms of Helot women's lives. Simple acts, a sideways glance, a whispered word, an accidental pause in the fields, carried the potential for suspicion and reprisal. The punishments of the past haunted every gesture in the present. Women learned to modulate their behavior constantly, internalizing caution so deeply that fear became second nature. In this sense, punishment created not just obedience, but identity. To be a Helot woman was to live with an inherited memory of pain, an unbroken thread connecting one generation's suffering to the next. And yet memory also preserved dignity in ways the Spartans may not have intended. Just as stories of humiliation warned against resistance, they also reminded Helots of their shared plight. A daughter listening to her mother's account of cruelty understood that her pain was not unique. It was part of a collective experience, something endured by her people as a whole. In this way, memory forged solidarity. If Sparta intended punishment to isolate and weaken, memory sometimes transformed it into a binding force, keeping Helot communities united in shared suffering. This dual function of memory, instilling fear while preserving identity, is why the cultural memory of punishment lasted so long. Even centuries later, when writers like Plutarch or Thucydides recorded fragments of Helot life, they often described a people haunted by the shadow of fear. Though those accounts were written by outsiders, they hint at the depth of memory helots themselves must have carried. Punishments left marks not only on bodies, but on entire communities, shaping how helots saw themselves in relation to Spartans. Archaeological evidence, though fragmentary, also speaks to this memory. In excavated Helot villages near Messenia, patterns of communal structures suggest strong kinship networks, where women played central roles in preserving cultural identity. While we cannot recover their songs or their whispered warnings, the very survival of Helot traditions despite centuries of oppression points to a memory culture that resisted total erasure. Punishment may have bent them, but it did not break their ability to remember, and through memory to endure. The cultural memory of punishment even outlasted Sparta itself. When Sparta fell from its position of power in later centuries, the image of Helot suffering remained part of its historical identity. Other Greeks, when speaking of Sparta, often mentioned its treatment of the Helots as a defining feature. The punishments of Helot women, though perhaps unrecorded in detail, contributed to this broader reputation. Sparta was not remembered only for its warriors, but for the terror it inflicted on those it enslaved. The cruelty became part of its legacy. And here lies a striking irony. The very system that depended on erasing Helot agency ended up immortalizing their suffering in historical memory. Though the voices of Helot women are largely absent from the surviving sources, the echoes of their pain still reach us across millennia. The punishments they endured did not vanish into silence. They became cultural memory first among the Helots themselves, then among the Greeks, and finally in the record of history that we piece together today. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of this memory is how it shaped Helot identity during their own lifetimes. Fear was not simply something inflicted, it was something inherited. A child born to a Helot woman did not need to witness a whipping or a ritual humiliation to know what awaited disobedience. The stories told by mothers, the scars visible on bodies, the silences around forbidden subjects, all of these transmitted fear like an heirloom. Punishment reproduced itself through memory, ensuring its effectiveness long after the lash had fallen silent. This, ultimately, was the genius and the horror of Spartan control. They did not need to punish every woman every day. They needed only to punish some in ways so visible and so memorable that all women carried the fear. Cultural memory did the rest. It filled the gaps between punishments, maintaining the atmosphere of dread that kept Helots in check. In the end, the cultural memory of punishment reveals the true depth of Spartan cruelty. It was not enough for them to break bodies. They sought to shape minds, to colonize memory itself, to turn fear into a generational inheritance. For Helot women, this meant living not just under the watch of their masters, but under the shadow of their mothers' and grandmothers' pain. Memory became the invisible chain, binding them across time, ensuring that punishment outlived the moment of its infliction. And yet, by preserving these memories, Helot women also preserved themselves. Their fear carried warnings, but their stories carried survival. They endured, they remembered, and through memory they passed on something the Spartans could never fully control: the truth of what was done to them. For centuries, Sparta has been remembered through a carefully polished myth. To popular imagination, it was a society of perfect warriors, men carved out of stone and iron, whose singular devotion to discipline and military glory placed them above all others in Greece. Even today, the word Spartan is invoked as shorthand for toughness, austerity, and martial excellence. Films, books, and modern military institutions have all borrowed from this myth. Yet, like every polished story, it gleams because something darker lies hidden beneath its surface. To understand Sparta fully is not only to admire its hoplites at Thermopylae or its disciplined phalanx formations. It is also to confront what Sparta did to those who had no voice, no shield, and no honor in the Spartan system. the Helot women. The unspeakable truth of Sparta is that its greatness rested on cruelty. The warriors admired by posterity were free to train only because the Helots worked the fields. The strict codes of honor and discipline that gave Sparta its legendary edge were made possible only because an enslaved class was forced into perpetual labor and fear. And within that system, Helot women bore the heaviest burdens. Their lives were not their own. Their labor, their bodies, even their children, all were appropriated to serve a state that celebrated strength while exploiting weakness. The myth of Spartan equality, often celebrated as unique in the ancient world, collapses when placed beside the reality of Helot suffering. Yes, Spartan women of citizen status enjoyed unusual freedoms compared to their Athenian counterparts. They owned land, managed estates, and spoke their minds in public. But this freedom was not born of enlightenment. It was purchased by the silence of Helot women, whose toil in the fields allowed Spartan women to live lives of relative privilege. The celebrated equality of citizen women existed only because enslaved women carried the weight of inequality. The myth of Sparta, therefore, is not a story of balance, but of imbalance, where the freedoms of a few were built on the bondage of many. What was done to Helot women was deliberately silenced. The Spartans themselves rarely recorded it, and later historians often looked away, preferring the clean heroics of Thermopylae to the dirtier truths of daily oppression. Yet the fragments that survive hint at horrors the Spartans considered too unspeakable to write openly. Accounts of Helot humiliation rituals, of systematic exploitation, of forced degradation, all point toward a reality too shameful for the Spartan mythmakers to admit. And what is omitted often tells us as much as what is preserved. The silence surrounding Helot women is itself a testimony. Their suffering was too central, too routine, too disturbing to fit into the story Sparta wanted the world to remember. But history does not allow silence forever. Even in fragments, the suffering of Helot women speaks. Their stories remind us that the greatness of Sparta cannot be told without them. To celebrate Spartan military genius without acknowledging its foundation is to perpetuate a myth, not history. The true Sparta was not just spears and shields, it was fear and oppression, humiliation and silence. The warriors who stood at Thermopylae did so because thousands of women toiled unseen, uncelebrated, and unspeakably exploited. The most chilling truth is that the suffering of Helot women was not incidental to Sparta as greatness. It was essential to it. The system was designed not merely to extract labor, but to create terror, to maintain control through humiliation, to make memory itself a prison. Their punishments, their degradations, their silences were the scaffolding on which the Spartan state was built. Without them, there would be no Spartan myth. And that is why the suffering of Helot women is unspeakable, not only in the sense of horror, but also in the sense of deliberate erasure. To speak of it is to dismantle the myth itself. This forces us to confront a difficult question: why do we remember Sparta the way we do? Why have the Helot women been erased from the story? Part of the answer lies in the nature of history itself. The voices that survive are those of the powerful, men who had no interest in recording the suffering of women they considered subhuman. But part of the answer lies in us. We have preferred the clean story, the heroic myth, the image of perfect warriors standing against impossible odds. It is easier to admire Sparta when the Helots are invisible. It is easier to celebrate strength when weakness is forgotten. Yet to do so is to repeat the cruelty of silence. To truly honor history, we must bring the Helot women back into the narrative. Their lives, their suffering, their resilience, and their memories are as much a part of Sparta as the gleaming bronze of hoplite shields. To remember them is to resist the myth. To speak of them is to restore balance to the story. And in remembering, we also uncover a timeless lesson. Sparta believed that fear could control memory, that silence could erase suffering, that punishment could define identity. But history has proven them wrong. The very fact that we can still ask these questions, still imagine the lives of Helot women, shows that memory endures. Silence never fully wins. The unspeakable always finds a way to be spoken. So the next time we hear the word Spartan invoked as a symbol of discipline or glory, we must also remember what lay beneath. We must remember the women whose labor sustained the system, whose bodies bore its cruelties, whose silences haunt the myth. Their story is not one of glory but of survival, not of conquest but of endurance, not of strength celebrated, but of strength unrecognized. This is the other face of Sparta, the one hidden in shadow, the one too easily forgotten. It is the face of Helot women, staring back across millennia, demanding that we see them, demanding that we remember. Their suffering was unspeakable, but their memory is not. And so we close this chapter of history with a challenge. Will we continue to admire the myth of Sparta without question, or will we confront the full truth? Will we tell only the story of warriors and battles, or will we also tell the story of the women who bore the cost? The choice belongs to us as students of history and as guardians of memory, because history is not only about what was done, it is about what we choose to remember. And if you believe these forgotten voices deserve to be heard, then join us, subscribe, share this story, and help bring history's shadows into the light.